record here. Okay. So yeah, perfect there. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be welcoming today to this webinar Rachel Irwin. She is a social anthropologist, and she's working at the moment in Lund University in the division of ethnology. And today she's going to present to us her work on looking into the visual culture of antimicrobial resistance. And this means like she's been looking into how we look at global health data, how we package it in visual form can actually influence the narratives and how we see the global health issues and the possibilities in the future about these global health issues. And in this particular example, she has been looking into AMR. So it's very interesting for us. And I'm really looking forward to her presenting her data, her conclusions, and her ideas around this topic. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being with us here today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so you can share yours and start the seminar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see the presentation. But I'm really excited to be here. I have two screens, so that's sometimes why instead of looking directly ahead, sometimes I end up looking this way. I think it's something that we're all learning how to manage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. So today I'll talk about the visual culture of antimicrobial resistance. And it really comes down to sort of three questions, right? And these are the questions that I'm interested in. Where does data come from and what do we do with it? How do we visualize data in global health and why does it matter? So I think with the first question, right, like I'm interested in things like projections, modeling, data on prevalence or incidence. So how do we actually come up with this data? What's good with it? What's wrong with it? And then the question around visualizing data, part of that is about graphs, right? But it's not just about graphs, it's about going beyond graphs to also photos and other types of representations. And also about verbal clues. So I talk about what I think of as being sort of different types of visual language. So when we're talking about antibiotics, we're talking about the post-antibiotic era. A lot of times you end up hearing language around the dark ages. And we can partially blame David Cameron for this because he used that term with the BBC, I think in 2012, 2013, maybe 2014. But it's not just about the graphs and the photos, but it's also different types of visual language that we use that invokes pictures in our minds. So I'm actually going to talk broadly a bit about how I got interested in this, and then I'll turn to AMR, but we'll have some breaks throughout the presentation where you can ask questions. So, speaking broadly, this is where I think for me, it all started. I think many of us have seen these visualizations. They come from the Global Burden of Disease study run by the Institute, primarily by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the Global Burden of Disease study, much of it's based on the Disability Adjusted Life Year, or DALY up here. And this type of visualization is supposed to demonstrate what the burden of disease is in the world. So this is global data, but if you go to their website, you can also disaggregate it by country, etc. And so in the blue, you see non-communicable diseases. So things like stroke, this is heart disease, migraine, diabetes. In the red, you see infectious disease and maternal child disease. And in the green, it's violence and injuries. And if you go to the website also, when you hover your cursor over these different boxes, it'll tell you the actual data, like the background data. But if you're looking at the global burden of disease, every single box, every single data point is a story within a story within a story. So while this is the global level, if you wanted to look at the data on just Sweden, so the data on Sweden itself comes from over 925 studies. And those studies in turn are based on different sources like census data, health registries, population surveys, administrative records. And these data points are not only the stories about the patients, but it's also about their families, about the researchers who did the study, about the clinicians, about the graphic designers and data scientists who came up with these kind of visualizations. And so I think I'm just really interested in this idea of how's an image even created? How's it viewed? And how do we understand global health or not understand global health when we see these kinds of data visualizations? So this is really how I got started with it. I think dollies are really interesting, and I think that these kind of visualizations are interesting. But it's also about photographs. And I want to say too, all data is politicized, but in different ways. This picture comes from an abstinence-based NGO in the United States. At first, I thought that these were actually people that were pregnant, but then if you look at their stomachs, it looks like they're wearing pillows because there's something weird about the shape. But they're literally wearing these shirts that say, "Don't be a statistic." And they're trying to get people to try abstinence, which we know does not work in terms of preventing teenage pregnancies, but that's their thing. And that's why I think it's easy to say that data is always politicized. But I thought it was kind of a funny photograph where they're saying literally, "Don't be a statistic." Reproductive health data, as a sidebar, reproductive health data is often very politicized because it's usually about who should or should not have children. It's about motherhood. And even if you look at something like maternal mortality, the maternal mortality ratio and different indicators around maternal mortality, those are also very politicized. So that's just one example. Another example is something like the health-related SDGs. This is also from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And again, if you hover over any of these on their website, it'll show you exactly which indicator. This is an example where you can see how they're progressing on the different indicators. And again, there's these questions about how do we decide what indicators to collect in the first place, what targets to use. You can even go back to how do we decide the goals for the SDGs? That's a completely different presentation. But all of those stories come together when you see a visualization like this. So it's not just about how well is the United Kingdom doing on the maternal mortality ratio. There's a lot of other stories that are embedded in this type of visualization. So I think I have this question: how do we study this visual culture of global health data? And I'm an anthropologist. I'm coming from this humanities, social science perspective. And I see it as studying specific moments within wider processes. So it might be things like around how we create and report data. So what's the role of the researcher, of the graphic designers, how we report data in the news and in the media, how we perform data. And I use the example of something like Gapminder or different TED Talks where different types of data and visualizations are used in a performance. How we make policy, what's the role of how do politicians and diplomats use data, and also how we consume and how we share data. If anyone's looked on Twitter in the last 12 months, you'll see a lot of these different types of data, maybe from the news, end up getting shared on Twitter. And Twitter is just full of different graphs about COVID-19, right? It's people who are both health professionals, non-health professionals, who are having these extensive Twitter debates over what data means, what graphs mean. So I think these are kind of the different moments that we can look at. So I'll give you a couple more non-AMR examples before we move on. This is a project I did a couple of years ago, and we were looking at the global mapping and analysis of anti-vehicle mine incidents. Many people are familiar with anti-personnel mines, but we were looking at anti-vehicle mines. And the difference generally has to do with weighting. So an anti-personnel mine is set to go off if a person steps on it. So if unfortunately, oftentimes it's a child, someone who we're looking like, maybe a bunny rabbit wouldn't set it off because they're not heavy enough, but sort of someone between, let's say, 25 to 200 kilos is going to set off one of those. To set off an anti-vehicle mine, it needs to be usually needs to be a much heavier thing or person. So it's usually a vehicle. Sometimes livestock can set one off. But we had this idea that we were going to try to map what's the burden, what's the impact of anti-vehicle mines. And it was really, really difficult for all kinds of reasons. I mean, we came up with there were 178 incidents, but there were way, way more than that. And part of the problem is that you have regular mines that are produced by an arms company. And then you have a lot of people who've taken parts of a mine and turned it into what we call an improvised explosive device, or an IED. And once the device has gone off, it's very difficult to tell if it was an actual mine that was manufactured or if it was an IED. So that was one of the problems. And then there's problems with reporting, et cetera, all the typical data problems you'd come up with. So we had to deal with that. We also had this question about how to disaggregate casualties by sex. Because we were really interested to know, is there a difference in burden of casualties? And when it came to actually representing the data, creating the report, I was really keen that I didn't want to have women represented wearing a skirt. But we actually had trouble figuring out how do we represent men and women differently without, sort of reverting to these stereotypes of the woman figure wearing a skirt. We had trouble with that, but we discussed it. The other thing too is that when we go back to how we present data, pictures are always really important. And I kind of feel that many times the data themselves, they don't matter unless you have some sort of photograph with them. So here's a photograph of an armored vehicle of a UN convoy in Mali. But at the same time, I think we all know that photographs lie, and you can show a photograph telling whatever story you want it to. So these are some of the challenges in how we represent facts and research. I don't know, are there any questions yet, Ava?
And not in the chat so far. Is if anybody wants to maybe ask a question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you prefer than writing it down in the chat. But there is no questions thus far. There's one hand up. Who has raised at the hand? Martin, you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. It's super interesting. I was just interested in when you say data does not matter unless you have a photograph. I would merely more explain it or think about it as it matters in a different way, or maybe not for the purpose you hope for. The mattering is not gone. It's just that it might not be what you hope for, or the purpose of the information on the presentation.
Yeah, actually, I completely agree. I think it's Friday afternoon. I'm a little bit informal, but you're absolutely right. I think it depends on what the purpose is and what you're trying to communicate. So obviously data can matter without a photograph. Absolutely.
I guess it depends also the context as to whom you are communicating. Data might matter in different ways, because if your audience really is going to look at the hard numbers, then of course you don't even need to put a photo next to it. But if you want to use the numbers for something else, then you kind of go easier if you visualize it somehow, I believe.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to these questions about exactly like you were saying, it goes back to these questions around what kind of media is it getting reported in, who's using it, what's the purpose.
Great. I think if there are no more questions or no more hands raised up, I think we can continue.
And I think there's also questions around power and legitimacy. And I'm going to talk about Gapminder just a little bit. And I think Gapminder used to have this tagline, unveiling the beauty of statistics for a fact-based worldview. And I think it's really fitting how they use this term beauty, right? Because so much of Gapminder is about how data can be visualized, how data can be beautiful. I think on one hand, I think that's really, really great. On the other hand, though, I think that I think I've had some challenges and some things I have felt uncomfortable with Gapminder. And part of it is that, Gapminder's sort of idea is that the world is getting better, right? And this is like this is the narrative, is that the world is getting better. Because in many ways, by many metrics, the world is getting better. But by other metrics, the world is getting worse. And it sort of depends on your perspective and where you're coming from. And I was at a conference about 3 or 4 years ago, and Ola Rosling gave a presentation, and someone raised their hand at the end and they asked the question. I forget the exact question, but it was a sort of a very reasonable explanation or question around the role of the private sector in health. And Ola Rosling actually interrupted the person who asked the question. And the person who asked the question was a student, so they were in a sort of a different power position than I think, a presenter who runs Gapminder is. And he interrupted her and he said, no, you're wrong. If you look at my data, you'll see that I'm right and you're wrong. So you're completely wrong. And he just sort of yelled at her for about 2 minutes about how she was wrong because his data was right. And I think it was a very uncomfortable feeling to see that kind of interaction where data can be wrong or right, but oftentimes it's these questions around what are we presenting? What are we actually showing? What's missing? What are the stories? And so it's not in a setting. I mean, if you looked at a graph like this, for example, babies per woman, total fertility, this tells you a certain question, it tells you a certain story about data, but of course there's a lot missing in here. I mean, without having in-depth knowledge of the Nigerian experience, and Nigeria is a huge country with, a lot of people in it. So everyone's experiences around fertility are going to be a little bit differently, even if we look at this, one specific line. So I think that there's also questions around how we use data to perform it, or how we perform. And this is also going back to this idea of how Twitter is used. This is an example. You can see this hashtag population, hashtag Europe. And this is a population map, but it's also a GIF. So it moves over time if you look at it on Twitter. So it moves from 1870 to 2000. And right now you see a lot of these types of heat maps on Twitter that have to do with COVID statistics. So before I move on specifically to talking about AMR, I just also want to say, are there any questions or thoughts about this visual culture of global health data before I move on to AMR?
How do you think that the fact that perhaps before global health data was only, let's say, managed, visualized, and shared from let's say official or people that work with that data, has changed to now that everyone basically can get access to that data, create their maps and share it online? How has that changed how people view global health and global health problems?
I think that's a great question, but I don't feel that I can answer that, right? I think that we need to do more research on that kind of idea of how do people actually use and understand graphs. So I think that you would need to be doing some sort of survey, maybe some interview-based studies to kind of get like really good data, no pun intended, on how people are actually, like what's the impact on people's lives of that. So I think that we can we all have experience with data, we all have experience with how people are using it, but I think I'd like to see more systematic research on how people are creating graphs and why.
We have 2 hands up, Daniel Normark first, and then Anna Lindström. Daniel, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Rachel. I think you have a very interesting sort of the production or presentation, and 2 short comments. There has been quite a lot of research done on centers of calculation in making data. And one of those that have studied that talks about the concentration of data that you create are forms of oligopticons. That you can capture the diseases of the entire world by ignoring everything else but one dimension, and especially your graphs show that in a very nice way. in that field, the research moving from creating oligopticons and its dependence on the visual has, however, not been that investigated. Whereas representations in scientific practice has been studied considerably historically, but not the visual dimension, the importance of the visual dimension in that. And that's why I think your research is really inspiring on that note. However, there is also another dimension that is playing in these images as well, and that is the differences between context of discovery, context of justification, and specifically context of application, where these kind of graphs or images or GIFs play different roles in trying to understand what is COVID or what are the political implications of COVID. Those are the same graphs can be used, or the same images can be used both for context of application, making policy, but also in discovery, what is this form of disease? So in that aspect, these images and understanding them and visual dimensions of them are really important. I realize that there is a question somewhere there, but I haven't described it as a question. I'll end there.
Great, thank you. I agree. I think there's like this sort of weird, like small niche sort of gap here where, you know, people study visual representations, but not the graphs, but some people have studied the graphs. And I think also what's really difficult is that there's a graph or other types of visualizations, they touch on so many different disciplines. So I think it can be really difficult where there's certain disciplines that I just have not really come in contact with, but I know that they're working on the same questions. And so I think that's a real, real challenge in studying this kind of subject matter where there's so many different disciplines and it's easy to miss really key pieces of literature or really key studies because it's in a different field that you wouldn't expect it to be in. So I think that's a real challenge in this area, is this interdisciplinary aspect.
Anna, you had your hand risen. If you
Hi Rachel. I was interested that you brought up Hans Rosling. I'm not very familiar with him myself, other than I've known that he's gotten a lot of international attention, or maybe he's mostly just like a favorite among Swedes. And it has to do, I mean, the thing that you brought up was the way he's responding, which I'm glad that you brought up, that, you know, quite a rude way. I think he's also handled journalists. But I was wondering, is this sort of just a Swedish thing that we think he's, you know, huge within this visual representation? What's your take on that as a research expert? Because that's where I think he's got a lot of attention in Sweden from this sort of unique way of representing facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think actually that Gapminder has been very influential. I think you're right. I think there's a certain, I don't know if it's pride, if we're excited to have a celebrity who's internationally recognized. I think that there's been a lot of attention in Sweden, but he's also been very influential. I guess Gapminder Foundation in general has been influential and has had a lot of contacts with, say, the Gates has collaboration with the Gates Foundation and other influential organizations in global health. So I think it goes beyond, it definitely goes beyond just Sweden.
good. Was there, Michael? Yeah, Martin, you had your hand up.
Thank you. Very short question, but maybe a very basic question to Rachel is, if we look at the global board of disease, there is both, you would say, hold drawn lines and the gradients. And that's a basic like visual language in my view, that we use a lot of this. For example, the board is that you're putting diseases within boxes. And especially when you consider things like syndemics that, for example, TBC and HIV/AIDS coexist and increase the effect of the disease for patients or people. I would just like to hear your thoughts about our visual language, that we use these lines so much and opposed to gradients.
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. And I don't have, it's such a good question. I don't have an answer for it. But I think it is this challenge where we do put diseases into boxes, and it can make it difficult to look at the gradients or look at the syndemics. And I think something like, an HIV, TB syndemic, okay, that's relatively easy to represent. But I think when you get into much more complicated syndemics, I think the next challenge is really understanding planetary health and understanding these complex ways in which the environment, climate, and weather all impact on health. So I think that's kind of the next challenge in how we're going to start trying to visualize these, because it's not so simple at all. But your question was so good, I don't have a good answer for it.
Thank you. I was interested in just hearing your view.
Great. I think we can continue with the presentation.
So I'll go on, and this is an article that came out in Medical Humanities a couple of months ago. So you can have also look at this, but I'll go over the main points. And I was interested in this idea of the post-antibiotic future, the visual culture of a global health threat, i.e. AMR. And I really looked primarily at popular culture. And there's certain assumptions that are implicit and explicit in the way that AMR is reported. Not everywhere. I mean, there's many different ways of understanding AMR. So I'm only talking about sort of stereotypes, generalizations. But there's this idea that if we do not take an action now, then we're somehow going to return to the dark ages of medicine. And there's an article by Brigitte Nierlich from 2009, and she talks about this catastrophic apocalyptic language used around AMR. I have a couple of references in the presentation, but I have got the full references at the end of the PowerPoint slide. So if you're curious in looking at these. There's a lot about how we're somehow at war with microbes. And there's also this contradiction that Claire Chandler notes, how a lot of governmental and intergovernmental reports will simultaneously allude to a lack of data while emphasizing a certain threat. So they're saying, we don't have data, we need more data on this, but bad things are going to happen if we don't act now. And so there's this weird kind of contradiction or tension between that. There's a lot of focus also on projections, not actual data. And then in terms of solving AMR, again, there's a lot of focus on these specific solutions around market-based incentives or combating irrational use. So there's actually surprisingly a lot of similarities when we look at popular culture representations of AMR. One thing that comes up is this rose chart. That's, I think everyone's seen this, right? It's from Antimicrobial Resistance, Tackling a Crisis for the Health and Wealth of Nations, which is from the AMR review that was commissioned by the UK government in 2014. And what their main projection is up here, that's by 2025, 10 million people will die from antimicrobial resistance. And I want to be clear, this is a projection. And De Kraker et al. Have an article where they kind of go through why there's problems with this projection. So I'm not going to get into that. You can read their article. It's great. But it's a projection from 2014. And what's interesting is that this key statistic, it comes up again and again in popular culture. It's the extent that rather than being a projection, it's almost become a fact in the way that it's been used. So I think that's interesting. Since we're at Uppsala, I'm sure there's probably someone from React here, I'm not sure. We can use this really nice graphic or this nice animation from the silent tsunami. And I don't want to critique anyone, right? Because I think it's a great animation, but it's interesting because the animation starts with a voiceover where someone says, the bacteria have fought back. And so it's speaking to this metaphor around war, how we're somehow at war with bacteria. And then this sort of infographic here, this animation, it's legitimately terrifying. So not only do you have gravestones, which are already scary, but then you have the skull and crossbones. And you see this sort of 10 billion by 2050. And so I think this really does speak to our fears about the post-antibiotic apocalypse. And you can watch the whole animation online. It's really interesting. And then again, I don't want to critique svenska nyheter because I love svenska nyheter, and I think it's really great how, as a program, it you know, sort of shows how there's different problems in society, and they do offer solutions. I think it's a really great satire program. And so in 2019, they did a piece that was on antimicrobial resistance. And so you see again this war metaphor where you have this airplane, this ciprofloxacin airplane that's dropping pills. The explosion is so large, it's hard to see, but there are little bacteria here, or little bacteria that are being killed by the ciprofloxacin airplane. So it's also speaking to this war metaphor. In the segment, he goes through these like sort of a popular culture understanding, the basics of AMR. And at the end of the segment, Beata Irwin comes on, and she sings this satirical song about dying of pus and boils and typhus. And so while they don't necessarily explicitly talk about the so-called dark ages, what's interesting about the segment is that singing a song about dying of pus and boils and typhus, it really speaks to that sort of dark ages metaphor. So that's one example. Another example I use is from a TED Talk by Maren McKenna from 2015. And in this talk, she starts really interestingly with this personal story of a great uncle who died of a bacterial infection in the 1930s. And she uses a lot of visual language. So she says, oh, if you go back through history, people died of infections after being gored by an ox. They were shot on a battlefield or crushed in one of the new factories of the Industrial Revolution. And she talks about how we're standing on the threshold of a post-antibiotic era. So really invoking this scary idea that we could go back to where we could go back to a time before we had so-called modern medicine. And she also uses this AMR review data, including the 10 million a year. And then the last photo that I have, it comes from a BBC documentary called The Truth About Antibiotics, but it was aired on SVT as well, clearly because it's a screenshot and there's Swedish subtitles. So it's about an hour long, and there's many different ways of visualizing AMR that they use. So in the beginning, they talk about how bacteria have become clever, they've learned to survive, sort of, again, giving human characteristics to bacteria that we're at war with. They talk about the 10 million people a year could die every year. And this is a really striking visual metaphor that they use, where there's 60 extras that are standing in a square. That's each person is representing 1 million people. So 60 million people is roughly the population of Great Britain. And so there's a voiceover that says almost half of these people could die if there weren't antibiotics. And this is Angela Rippon, she's the host. She walks through the square and she knocks over people. And there's this voiceover that's saying that these deaths could be caused by lack of access to cesarean sections, no chemotherapy, no routine surgeries, et cetera, et cetera. And at the very end of it, the host, Angela Rippon, she stands there and she says, oh, before antibiotics, 40% of us would die from infections. So again, kind of raising these questions, these emotional connections or these emotional fears around, if we don't have antibiotics, if we don't act now, then we'll go back to before modern medicine. So before I conclude, I just want to see also, are there any questions right now or any comments about the AMR examples that I've used?
Martin, hand raised.
Yeah, sorry. Super interesting. I just want to hear, Rachel, on your view of this going back. What your view of that metaphor, because it's especially complicated, I would say, by not everyone having access. So going back is not an option for them.
I think that I have two issues with the going back, and there's two different ways to think about this. One is this idea of the Dark Ages, and I really am not happy with the way that people will use this idea of the Dark Ages or medieval times, because there's been some. I'm not a historian of medieval Europe. I've just read things that they've written, so I can't speak as a historian of medieval Europe. But a lot of historians of medieval Europe have said, look, the Dark Ages were a lot more interesting than people have this idea that they are. There was actually a lot of scientific progress, et cetera. Life was not as terrible as we might think of it in popular imagination. So popular imagination of the Dark Ages is not really reflective of what the Dark Ages in fact were. Part of the problem is that during the Renaissance, a lot of Renaissance thinkers sort of saw ancient Rome or ancient Greece as being this height of civilization, and started, thinking of the Dark Ages as we might think of them today. So that's part of the problem. In the Dark Ages, early medieval Europe was so different than Europe today, so it's really difficult to even make comparisons. I mean, look, obviously no one wants to go back to medical surgical practices of the time, but it's a really poor comparison that's based on a misunderstanding of history. So I think that there's that part where I don't like that going back to the Dark Ages metaphor. But if we think about, okay, are we going to go back to the 1930s? That's also another problem. And part of it is, if you think back, say 110 years ago, 110 years ago, germ theory was new. Not everyone believed that germs, that there was, actually bacteria, viruses, etc. So even if all antibiotics stopped working today, something happened and they just stopped working completely today, well, we understand the microbial world much better than we did 110 years ago. We have all kinds of advances in sanitation, that make life better. Some of our risk factors today are different or worse, but we don't have the same risk factors that we did 70 years ago. And you can talk about this idea that people used to die being gored by an ox. Well, I mean, I guess there's a lot of wild boar in Skåne, but I don't think that I'm going to be gored by an ox. That's not something that I worry about. I'm much more likely to get a resistant infection if I go on holiday to Thailand. So there's differences in risk factors. So what I'm getting to is I think this idea of going back is difficult because we're not going back to anything, we're going into a future that's going to be different than the past.
Yeah, I think that's completely correct. And I would just add that the going back to the dark medieval times is also, from my perspective, very much Eurocentric, because during that same time, if you go to India, if you go to Middle East, they said, oh, this was a bright time. We had a lot of science, we had a lot of progress in medical research. This was a height point in comparison to the before and after, especially during colonial times. So it's also coming back to where you are, and it becomes very problematic if you push this in a global setting where people actually have another historic experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, how if the future will have no antibiotics, I think it will really look very different than the past with no antibiotics. Yeah, for all the contexts around, for sure.
I mean that's obviously I don't want the antibiotics to stop working. I'm really glad that we have antibiotics. So I'm not trying to say that a future without antibiotics looks good. It doesn't look like the past.
But I guess in narratives, apart from sci-fi and trying to make new futures that look like whatever we invent in our heads, which is a different thing, I think people try to envision the future based on the experiences and the things that they know or they think they know. So it's always reasonable that when someone will make a projection about how a future will look like, to not be putting your heads into something that we don't even know if it's going to be like that, like sci-fi type of utopia or dystopian futures. We just recourse to what has already happened in the past, I guess. And that's kind of maybe a bias that we always going to have with us in the way we see the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we might continue now. There's no more hands up.
Great. Well, so I'll just sort of conclude. And I think it's this idea that behind every data point is a story or is a set of stories. And I think someone already made this point. There's actually like a lot of research that's been done on why collecting data is difficult. And it sometimes when you, but I mean, we all do this, right? Like I had a lecture this morning where I just presented a graph to my students because I didn't have time or energy to go into all the problems that were there, all the problems in collecting that specific data. So I think we all of us at some point have showed a graph without going into the details of why it was challenging, in part because we don't have the time to do all of that. But in any case, behind every data point is a story. And visualizations can create new ways to communicate good data and to raise awareness. And I think that was one thing that was, I think, really positive about the popular culture examples that I used today, where I think it's great that we're raising awareness around antimicrobial resistance. But at the same time, visualizations can also ways to sort of can create new ways to hide bad data, to gloss over how data is collected and handled. And sometimes this beauty of data can distract us from the limitations. So I would say, from the humanities or social science perspective, I'm interested in seeing global health visualization as a series of interconnected moments that are about the way we produce and consume data. And it raises questions, who has the authority to create, interpret, perform, and share different types of visualizations? And what is this relationship between visualizations, textually supported statistics, photographs, animations as some sort of package of evidence that either people use in their daily lives to make decisions, or that politicians, diplomats, civil servants use.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it matters for so many reasons, but sometimes I think that this visual culture, these graphs, the photos, the representations, they do blend together to create a set of dominant narratives that sometimes can reinforce unhelpful metaphors and repeat dubious projections as true. And this might be the 10 million by 2050 that has almost become truth because we hear it so often. Or it's this idea that we've already talked about, where the post-antibacterial future is not the dark ages. And I think to some extent, some of these dominant framings can really, we get stuck into a way of thinking, and it keeps us from really looking at novel solutions.
Great. Just to make a comment, I personally always had a problem with the 10 million by 2050, because the way I actually use that number or that statistic when I present, for example, our center, or I present the problem when I talk to students or people, I might show even the graph from, the rows graph from the AMR review. And I would say, this, and I make a point to say, like, this is a prediction and this is what they think will look like if we don't do absolutely anything. But the fact that I'm here today, I'm talking to you about it, and everything that is happening at the same time about this, it will most likely not be the truth by 2050. I think we need to be reasonable to think like, yeah, it might be a prediction. It might be even the worst of the predictions, your worst case scenario, but most likely that's not going to be the reality, right? Because otherwise, why are we talking about it? So I think the narrative or the storytelling in which these data and graphs are used can also make a difference, right? In a way.
Yeah. Absolutely, that's such a good point. It's if we do nothing, we're not doing nothing. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure too you can see these references. I guess I can share the slides later, but it's this new question: will 10 million people die a year due to antimicrobial resistance? And then work by Sherry Conder and Brigitte and Ehrlich that I think is also really helpful.
That's great. We still have actually like 10 minutes, good of 10 minutes for some discussion and questions. If anyone else of you want to be part of it, maybe Martin has more questions, more comments. Yes.
I have more, if you allow me. Thank you again, Rachel. It's super interesting, and I get a lot of ideas or questions for you. One thing, you mentioned the war metaphor, but I'm also interested in what I feel recurring in a lot of the information is if you talk about communication, education, or information, but by fear. That it's aimed at creating that emotional and physical reaction, that stimulus, because it's both a psychological thing, but it's also very bodily thing, the fear. And have you thought about that, or what's your view on that?
So I have not thought about that, but Brigitte Nerlich she talks about that in her article, and she sort of poses this question, right? Like, is fear going to push us into action, or is fear just going to paralyze us? And I think that fear can be helpful to a certain extent, but I kind of agree with what she gets at in her article, where if you just scare people, you can quite easily scare people into inaction. So I think there's a sort of a balance there. I don't think that a totally fear-based approach is helpful. But Brigitte Nerlich has thought about it a lot more in depth than I have, so I'd recommend you read her article.
Yeah, because I'm just coming from a sustainability perspective and education there, where especially climate change is usually, the research has pointed that you need to offer some kind of way forward, because otherwise people get stuck in the moment. If it's just fear and no way of doing action, then it leads nowhere. It's just a physical, like an emotional reaction that has no direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we did a small scale survey in Lund. I think we had about 150 respondents. And it's not like a there's no like sampling. Like sampling is not great on the survey, so I don't want to say anything useful from it. But we had 150 people, and a lot of the responses were things like, we're worried about AMR, but we think that medicine's going to solve it, or we think that science will come up with an option. Or some people said, oh, I'm worried about it, but I'll be dead before it's a problem. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing that maybe someone could look into more systematically, how we, this idea, okay, well, we're worried, but we think that there's going to be a solution because we trust science, which is, I don't know, interesting.
Mm-hmm. Andreas has the hand up.
Yeah, thanks. From React Europe, I'm the director at React Europe. Thanks for showing the Tsunami video. We've been actually we haven't used that specific video too much lately. We're actually working on revising it, mainly because we are more and more trying to avoid the war metaphor, as well as avoiding to use the O'Neill numbers. First, avoiding the O'Neill numbers is basically because we want to put focus on the antibiotic resistant matter of things, so the bacteria, and that estimate includes HIV, TB, and malaria, and assumes a projection of development of 100% resistance in those three. So we generally try to avoid using that. So in the revised version of the video, you will not see those death bars using those numbers, as well as also cleaning up the messaging from the war metaphor. We've been using a language that is more around microbes are part of the natural symbiosis with humans, right? Mm-hmm. That it's part of the One Health perspective of that it's nothing strange or threatening, and microbes and bacteria are not only evil, it's part of the ecosystem, and trying to build on that narrative instead. So we have a lot of these discussions within the React network on what works in different settings and different populations, and how we communicate it in, for example, Latin America is much more around Mother Earth and seeing bacteria as part of the natural flora and the ecosystem that we both exist in, and that antibiotic resistance then is just a natural phenomenon. And we're more looking forward. We know that we're trying not to look back, but rather envision that we do not want to end up in a situation where we cannot treat the infections. We do not want, our vision is also towards that of like avoiding that we're ending up in not being able to treat infections, but that is more of a forward-looking perspective than a backward-looking perspective.
Oh, I think that's really interesting. And it's interesting, like the conversations that you've had about making these shifts. So I think that's really great. Thanks for sharing. I just want to say I didn't want to critique the animation, but I think some of because I've used different sources from kind of 2012 up until today, I think that we have started to see shifts around, see more language around One Health and how we talk about microbes. So I think it's interesting how those perspectives have changed over less than a decade.
Related to that, because we didn't talk so much about the vision that microbes were here way before us, and antibiotic resistance is nothing new. The only problem is that we are in the middle of it, so to speak. I wonder, in order to change the narrative from these war-based metaphors and this at war with microbes, I think the general knowledge, education, and understanding of people about microbes has to be the base of it, because I think the war metaphor and the apocalyptic future works because that's what most of people have in their core, and their knowledge is that bacteria are bad and bacteria create disease and we have to get rid of bacteria. So there is no another knowledge that they need to have to understand the war metaphor. Whereas to understand the balance and an ecosystem that is working with bacteria in us, within us, and around us, they need to understand that that's the basis, that that's how it works, and that is good. So I think in order for these narratives to really work, to have a weight and people to understand them, there has to be an education around this that doesn't have to do with antibiotic resistance or AMR or any of this issue. And we are lacking there. So that's kind of, first we need the people to understand what is the natural situation of things, and then to apply this narrative to AMR. So I find that it's of course tricky, and there are a lot of different angles where work is needed, not just only on changing the narratives around AMR. Is there any other questions? Anybody that would like to? Yeah, this one hand. Martin, yeah.
A final thing, just wanted to test an idea to Rachel. On the board again, instead of doing these lines, could you do a watercolor for all the board? Would that be a way of addressing it? You go back to the boxes there.
Yeah.
We were talking about how to actually visualize that there is gradient. Could we do a watercolor between the, like, instead of having it's like a pencil sketch, you do watercolor?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about this, right? I'm just thinking aloud. I think this is a great question. But how would you, like, if you thought about something like air pollution? I mean, there's so much. I mean, I'm not an air pollution specialist, but off the top of my head, I'm thinking, okay, so we've got to somehow get asthma, probably stroke, heart disease, lung diseases. I mean, I think it's, I don't know, maybe a circle, maybe like a circle with blurry, with like this watercolor blurry lines. Maybe that's an idea.
Yeah, it's just crossing those boundaries and showing something being distinct while there is boundary crossing. Okay.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Watercolors. But I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But now
I was just curious.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
I guess it would be a bit like an application of a Venn diagram of sorts, but in a gradient way or something, so you can show overlapping of things.
But I wonder too, because I think like with the classic Venn diagram, right, you've had like equal circles, and I think what would be interesting to get at would be how how like a certain risk factor will not necessarily impact 3 diseases exactly equally. So like a certain risk factor might only contribute 5% to one, like it's something like alcohol, right? Like alcohol might only, or the misuse of alcohol would contribute more proportionally to, in a certain setting, to, I don't know, like liver disease than to road traffic accidents. So you try to get sort of an idea of what's the burden of that. I'm just talking aloud now.
Yeah, but I understand what you are trying to say. Like it would be maybe 5% to one and 1% to the other, and then 30% to another. So how to represent that in a 2-dimensional situation is a bit hard.
Yeah, but it's also, I think it's going to be different. Like you can look at the global level, but obviously, like if you have good roads, even if you have the same proportion of people drinking, or people drinking and driving, if you have good roads, less people are going to die than if you have bad roads. So then you have to also think about that. Oh, this is really interesting. I think it's I have something to think about over lunch now.
Cool. Nice. Anybody, any other questions, comments? We are, some people were dropping off and they were writing on the chat that it was a very interesting talk and thank you so much. So I'm just passing on the message.
Oh, that's great.
I
can see the chat now.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
So yeah, everyone really enjoyed having this new perspective. These are things that, we are exposed to them day in, day out, all of us, but we sometimes don't really stop to think about the implications of them and how, a lot of people make visualizations almost with no intent. It's just, let's just put this data together and show it in a way, and it can actually have much more impact than one might think. So it's refreshing and it's very inspiring to think about this topic. So with that, we are almost at 1. So for once we are on time. It's very nice. To say also that Rachel is going to be interviewed for the podcast. So an interview with her is going to be released on the podcast on the beginning of May. So if you want to get to know a little bit more about her background, how did she get to the AMR issue in particular, and some more insight about her work, I recommend you that you check the podcast in May. And also there's going to be on Monday the release of the new episode of the podcast, in this case with React as the key light for the episode. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and you join us also for the next seminar at the beginning of May. I see a lot of clapping. Thank you so much. And again, I'm looking forward to interview for the podcast and having you there as well, Rachel. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.